Okay, so chapter 12 is called Sixth Amendment. And at the end of chapter 11, the kind of like horrible ending of that chapter was that everyone has found out that the money that Evan had in his shorts was money that he stole to begin with. And now the whole fourth grade class knows. So, chapter 12, Sixth Amendment. The part of the U.S. Constitution that explains the rights of anyone who is accused of a crime and brought to trial, including the right to legal counsel. Jessie whispered. The prosecution rests, and she and Evan went back to their seats. Evan kept his eyes nailed to the ground. He didn't trust himself to look at Jessie. If he did, he knew that all his anger was going to spill over like lava pouring out of a crack in the earth's crust. He'd been humiliated in front of the entire fourth grade. And even though he knew that Jessie hadn't done it on purpose, it was still all her fault. If she hadn't called him as a witness, if she hadn't made David the judge, if she hadn't given Scott Spencer that stupid arrest warrant in the first place, none of this would have happened. David banged his gavel 3 times. Will the lawyer for the defense please step forward? Evan saw Scott twist his head around and look at the parking lot. We gotta wait a couple more minutes, said Scott matter-of-factly. My mom's not here yet. If she doesn't come, said Paul, does Scott have to forfeit? David flipped through his cards. Jessie, does Scott forfeit if his mom doesn't come? Here she is, shouted Scott, jumping up from his ball. I told you, I told you. He turned to Jessie. Now you're going to see how it's done by a real lawyer. She's going to make you look like a fool. Scott ran off to the parking lot where a large gray SUV was pulling up to the curb. Evan watched as Scott ran up to the car and leaned in at the window, talking with his mom. Scott turned around and pointed at all the kids sitting in the courtroom. Evan could just barely see Mrs. Spencer, her hands on the wheel, the engine of the car still running. Then, Scott stepped back from the car, and it drove away. Scott came walking back and sat down on his basketball. He shrugged, but Evan could tell it was an act. She can't stay, said Scott. She's got a big meeting. Real stuff, not kid stuff. He shrugged again and looked straight ahead at David, avoiding everyone else's eyes. So, said David, what do we do now? Everyone in the courtroom turned to Jessie, who had been keeping quiet ever since she sat down. Evan looked at Jessie. She wasn't smiling, and that surprised him. After all, this meant they won, right? At least, that's how it worked in basketball. If the other team didn't show up, or didn't have enough players, then they forfeited the game, and that meant your team won automatically. Usually, Evan hated forfeited games, even if it meant winning. He'd rather play and lose than win by forfeit. But this time, Evan would take a win any way he could get it. The image that had been haunting him for days of standing up at morning meeting and apologizing to Scott began to fade, and a new one took its place. Evan, playing with his new Xbox 2020 with all his friends over at his house. Jessie said, David, you say, will the lawyer for the defense please step forward? And then Scott says, well, whatever he wants to say in his own defense. And then he says, the defense rests, and that's it. And then the verdict, said Sally Knight, who was in the jury box. Then we vote and give the verdict. Right, said Jessie glumly. What was her problem? Wondered Evan. They were sure to win if Scott had no defense lawyer. Ahem, David cleared his throat. Will the lawyer for the defense please step forward? Everyone turned to look at Scott, but it was a voice from the back of the courtroom that broke the silence. That would be me. Meghan stood up from the audience and walked to the front of the courtroom. What? At first, Evan thought he must have heard wrong. Did Meghan Moriarty just say that she was going to defend Scott Spencer? You can't do that, said Evan, jumping up from his seat. He wanted to shout, you're supposed to be on my side, not his. But he couldn't say that, not in front of the whole fourth grade. Hey, shouted David, banging his gavel. Order in the court. Plaintiff, sit down. If you keep making a disturbance, I'll have to throw you out of court. Oh, right, like you could, said Evan. But he sat down on his basketball anyway. Jessie, said David, holding up his watch. It's 3:30. I've got to go in 10 minutes. Is this allowed? Jessie nodded her head. Yes, it's fair. Evan couldn't believe it. Was this really happening? Was the girl he was in love with about to destroy his one and only chance for revenge against his sworn enemy? Meghan turned to Scott. Do you still not want a girl lawyer? Once again, Scott shrugged. You're all I got. I guess it's okay. All right, said Meghan. This won't take long. Can I call my first witness? David nodded, and Meghan moved to the front of the courtroom. And I'll be back tomorrow with Chapter 13. Bye, guys.